Hello and welcome to this new episode of a WCO Integrity web series hosted by the Anti-Corruption and Integrity Promotion Program. As you know, our purpose here is to invite experts from around the world and shed some light on issues relating to integrity in customs. In this episode, Shanshan Yu is here to tell us about the Customs Integrity Perception Survey, CIPS, developed within the context of the ACIP program. Shanshan is data analyst for the ACIP program, and so she knows all about the findings and applications of the CIPS. But first, for those of us who would know nothing about the CIPS, please tell us what it is and what it does.
Sure. The Customs Integrity Perception Survey, CIPS, is an important component among several different tools we use to gauge the integrity of customs administrations, which is often hard to assess. This is because customs often involve numerous parties, complex procedures, and large volumes of goods. Assessing the integrity in customs, therefore, requires a comprehensive approach, including several different methods of assessment. Because integrity is also about human behavior and the thought processes behind it, perceptions are a very useful element to look at. CIPS complements other WCO tools such as Integrity Development Guide, and both define integrity as the adherence to standards outlined by the 10 key factors of the revised Arusha Declaration, which encompass all aspects of customs operations and administrations. The questions in the survey help to quantify the adherence to each of the 10 key factors, as they can also be used as indicators to evaluate whether a certain objective is achieved. For instance, to assess the key factor of regulatory framework, a certain group of questions are taken as indicators that determine whether the complexity of regulations can affect officials when performing their duties, the burden regulations can place on their administration, and the effectiveness of regulations in reducing the risk of integrity violations. It's important to note that different indicators for the same assessment area are developed for the customs officials and the private sector surveys, as they have differing perspectives because of their different positions. For instance, regulations may pose a challenge for officials to administer, while for the private sector, they may impact compliance.
We can also note that all indicators or questions in the survey are the 10 key factors or assessing those aspects where customs would have some control over. So the responses can provide insights that can help inform decisions and target actions to improve things.
Yes, and there are also democratic indicators such as gender, experience, and respondents' roles as leaders in their administration. Our listeners can actually access the guidelines of the CIPS methodology on the ACIP program webpage, and all the questions, which are grouped by each key factor, both for the customs officials and the private sector representatives, are laid out in the annexes of the methodological guidelines. The guidelines are available in English, French, Arabic, Spanish, and Portuguese.
Let's actually talk a bit more about the work done by the ACIP program with the CIPS.
Absolutely. A bit of history first. CIPS was initially rolled out in 10 ACIP partner countries at the beginning of 2020, and later in the year, it was extended to an additional 7 countries. In 2021, CIPS was then carried out in 8 more countries that had joined the ACIP program, bringing the total number of participants to 25. And more recently, between January and March 2023, CIPS was conducted for the second time in 10 countries in order to gauge the progress since their first iteration. Data provided by CIPS is incorporated in several aspects of the work under the ACIP program. This data represents direct feedback from customs officials and the private sector stakeholders, which allows us to see what those groups think of customs integrity, and to see that there are sometimes some gaps between the internal perception of integrity by the customs officials and the external perception by the private sector. Often, it is the customs officials that have a more positive opinion. For example, they feel the most positive about the key factors such as relationship with the private sector, code of conduct, and morale and organizational culture, while less positive about human resources management, automation, and transparency. For the private sector, regulatory framework, transparency, and reform and modernization are scoring much lower.
Over the past few months, a significant amount of work has been carried out by the AC program to look at the relationship among indicators under different key factors. And the results allow to design performance measurement techniques to set certain key performance indicators that allow to monitor the level of integrity over time and in ACIP activities. Can you give us some example, please?
Sure. So for instance, we looked at the indicator whistleblower protection, which is whether an official would feel safe to report instances of integrity violations. We then identified the other indicators that have a relatively strong correlation with our target here. A logistic model was built by making whistleblower protection as our target variable and the other indicators the independent variables. The results showed that these indicators together will indeed determine whether an official would feel safe enough to report. The determinant indicators include, for example, action in response to reports, which is phrased as reports of corrupt behavior in my customs administration would result in actions against that behavior. And fairness of investigation, which is phrased as reports of corruption in my administration are investigated in a fair manner. These two are indicators from the same key factor, audit and investigation. Other key factors also play a role. For example, regarding leadership and commitment, whether senior management is setting a positive example to fight against corruption, and whether management would encourage their employees to report instances of corruption. In addition, regarding code of conduct, whether the code of conduct is applied in a fair manner. And regarding morale and organizational culture, whether the organization has a high ethical standard can also be influential of the result. In a nutshell, the more positive the determinant indicators are, the more positive will our target whistleblower protection become. The same technique is applied to the private sector survey on the same target variable whistleblower protection using other relevant indicators.
Looking at the results of the different analysis you've made, we clearly get confirmation that integrity is a cross-cutting issue. All key factors of a revised Arusha declaration are correlated and influential to each other. The data shows that a synergy approach should be taken to promote integrity, and this clearly validates the main principle of a revised Arusha declaration, that is that a national customs integrity program must address multiple factors in order to be effective.
Exactly. We can work under the assumption that if there is improvement in the level of integrity in reality, and then based on SPID data, we can see the scores are becoming higher, hinting the perception is more positive, both for customs officials and the private sector. When looking at the data we actually received from the second iteration of the SPIDs in the 10 volunteering countries earlier this year, we do see that scores of all 10 key factors have improved for customs officials, while not entirely for the private sector, which proves that it's more challenging to change the perception of the private sector, as well as closing the gaps between the internal and external view. We will also cross-validate SPID data with KPIs from the Performance Measurement Working Group so that we can also make use of, for instance, percentage of integrity violations, the effectiveness of reporting mechanisms.
You mentioned during the Integrity Subcommittee that this data is a starting point of dialogue for ACIP beneficiaries, that it sparks collective action.
Yes, data from SPIDs can help us locate where the problems come from, and so we can allocate resources to tackle these problems. It also allows a more effective introspection, and so we can identify the next steps needed in order to change the perspectives, both within customs and of the private sector. the potential use of SIPs also lies beyond the ASIP program. Firstly, we can analyze it together with other datasets, such as number of reports of corruption actually reported in a member state. In addition, the methodological guidelines of SIPs can be updated to include methods of data analysis, performance measurement, so that it can be used by others who are interested in investigating the issue of integrity.
Thank you very much for this great insight into the Customs Integrity Perception Survey, Shanshan. There is no doubt of the interest this topic raised during the latest WCO Integrity Subcommittee. Thank you all for listening to this new episode and see you soon. Bye for now.